Thank you so much for joining the Northwest Church YouTube channel. If you'd like to follow along with the message today, you can check out the notes linked in the description below. Let's jump into the message.
I want to get started in the Word this morning, and I want to start with a story. I typically don't do this, but it's just a simple little story. But I went to a doctor, it's been several years ago now, for my annual checkup. And by the way, I would recommend that. I still do that. I'd recommend going to getting an annual checkup. And conversation started about my family history, our family health history, and about my current health. And during that conversation is when I first heard the term silent killer. Silent killer. It's the first time I ever heard it. It's been a few years ago now. But he was talking about high blood pressure and bad cholesterol. And even though you can't see it, he said it's there and it can do a lot of damage to your body. And that's why, again, that's why it's called a silent killer. And since that conversation, I have been intentional. I did not say consistent, but I have been intentional about my diet and about my exercise. And just as there are silent killers physically, there are also some silent killers emotionally and spiritually. And so today we're starting a new series called Silent Killers. Even as Christ followers, we can have issues, unseen and unspoken, keeping us from everything that God has for us. What I have learned is that many of these silent killers are distractions. They are intentional on the part of the devil. And so today we're starting this new series, and we're going to be looking at these things that go unnoticed, unchecked, and therefore they must be confronted and corrected. If we don't confront, if we don't correct these things, then again, we're going to deal with it later. There's going to be some serious consequences to these things. So we're going to be talking about a lot of things over the next few weeks, and some of this is going to be a little heavy. But the thing I'm most excited about in this series is this is going to be one of the most practical series that I've ever preached. So we're going to be talking about things like unforgiveness. How many know that's hard? Come on, that's really tough. And we're also going to be talking about shame. Has anyone ever done something you felt ashamed of it or embarrassed about it and you wish you had a giant eraser in life? You could just go back and just kind of erase that out. And so we're going to be talking about that. How about apathy? It's one of the great concerns I have for our nation today. It's like people have just given up on life and they don't care anymore. They don't care that you know that they don't care about it. There's just a spirit of apathy like I've never seen in my life. We're going to talk about that. How about this one? How about doubt? Has anyone ever faced doubt and fear in your life? You just doubt if God's going to answer, if God's going to do this or not do that. And so we're just sometimes our minds and our spirit, it's filled with doubt and fear. And I'm going to talk about that. But today I want to talk about loneliness. Now, I know some of you are like, well, it's easy. I get to check out. I'm not lonely. Because a lot of times when you hear that word lonely, a lot of you sometimes, how many of us think about maybe a single parent and think, well, they're alone. You know, they don't have the support of a spouse. Or maybe it's a child that's lost their father or their mother. And you think, well, they're alone. They're lonely. Or you talk about single people. How many think about maybe family members? And you know people who maybe live in Northwest Arkansas, even come to Northwest Church with their family lives way off somewhere. And you're like, you know, they're just lonely people. And those are all true, and they're great examples. But I know from experience that you can be in a room full of people and still be lonely. Now, I'm not going to preach on this part, but I do want to hit pause because I want to give you something free today, okay? So if you don't like it, don't get upset because it's free. It's not going to cost you anything. But there's a profound difference in alone and loneliness. When you read the Gospels, often you will read where Jesus would get up early in the morning and he would go and find a place and be alone where he could spend time in prayer with God the Father. And so he was often alone. And those times are intentional. And loneliness is not always intentional. Sometimes it's intentional. But most of the time, we're not lonely because it's intentional. We're not lonely because it's us. We're lonely because of other factors and other issues in my life. But here's what I want you to know. It is the trick of the enemy to get you alone and to make you feel like that you are alone and nobody sees you, nobody cares about you, nobody knows who you really are. Again, he's been doing this going all the way back to the Garden of Eden because he knows if he can get you alone and get you separated from your friends and your family and get you feeling like you're the only one in this valley, he's got a much better chance at taking you out. Being alone makes you very vulnerable in this world today. But here's what I do know. I think being alone, and loneliness, both, I believe, to some degree, are a choice. I do believe they are a choice to some degree. So you can choose to be lonely, or you can choose to come out of that season of loneliness as well. But I do believe it's a choice. I believe that. It's free. I'm going to move on. For some of you this morning, even though you're married, you have a family, even friends, you can still experience loneliness in your life. Have you ever felt no one really sees, hears, or understands who I am or what I'm going through? Just like high blood pressure, people can't see it on the outside, but it's taking place on the inside. And if you don't do something about this, you're going to literally implode, or it feels like you're going to implode. And on the outside, you seem happy. You have your church smile. Everybody do the church smile. That's what we do every Sunday morning. It's like, here we go. Got to put on the church smile. And then we have the old, yeah, I'm okay spiel. You know what I'm saying? How you doing? Well, I'm okay. Yeah, no, I'm a mess, but I'm lying in church and telling you I'm okay. Anybody know what I'm talking about? We've all been there and done that. But on the inside, you're hurting, you're lonely. Well, some of you this morning, just want you to know you're in good company. Because when you read the Bible in the Old and New Testament, it is literally filled with stories of great men and women who experienced moments and seasons of loneliness. So I just want you to know, don't buy into the lie of the enemy that you're the only one in your valley of loneliness this morning. You're the only one that's ever going through a season of loneliness. Because again, when you read the Bible, it's filled with great men and women who experience moments and seasons of loneliness. It's not if, but when you experience loneliness. I want to give you 3 things today that I want you to put in your backpack and I want you to take home with you. Now, I want you to take your Bibles because we are a word-based church at Northwest. And because of that, will you open your Bibles this morning? Let's go to Genesis chapter 16. And I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. This is, by the way, is one of the great stories in the Old Testament. So when you get some time this week, make sure that you go back and read this entire story. It's a great story. So let's begin reading Genesis chapter 16, begin reading in verse 1. Now, this is Sarai and Abram here. If you remember, later God's going to change their name from Sarai to Sarah and from Abram to Abraham. So you know that. So I don't want to confuse anybody, so we're just going to say Sarah and Abraham. How about that? And it's a lot easier to pronounce for me too. So now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abraham, the Lord has prevented me. Watch this. She blames this on the Lord. The Lord has prevented me from having children. So I want you to go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abraham agreed with Sarah's proposal. Not smart. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abraham as a wife. This happened 10 years ago after Abraham had settled in the land of Canaan. So right motive, but wrong move, okay? So Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. She began to treat her mistress, Sarah, with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abraham, this is all your fault. Whose idea was this? This is your fault, Abraham. I put my servant into your arms. I got to tell you the story. The other day, Christy and I were talking. And I'm going to go over here because this is going to cost me a little bit today. But we were talking the other day, and I just said, baby, I'm just curious. Why is it that everything seems to be my fault? And she said, well, Joe, that's easy. Everything is your fault. So, moving on. Okay, this is all your fault, Joe. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant. She treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me. Look at verse 6. Abraham replied, Lord, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. Then Sarah treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. It's a great story, okay? So I want to give you three things today, not if, but when you experience a season of loneliness. Number one, we're not going to deny this. We're not going to run away from this. We're not going to hide from this, okay? We're not going to displace this. But number one, it's the pain of loneliness. It's in your notes this morning. We're going to talk about, for a moment, the pain of loneliness. Now go back, look at verse 6. So Abraham replied, look, she is your servant. So deal with her as you see fit. So Sarah treated Hagar so harshly. By the way, that word harshly is translated in the Hebrew language as oppressed. So this was a serious deal that's going on here, to the point that she ran away. Hagar ran away. Now, angel of the Lord found Hagar. Now, this is interesting to me. I'll talk more about that later. But that the angel found Hagar. Hagar did not find the angel, but the angel found her, and found her in the desert, or in the wilderness. Now, when you read about the desert in the wilderness, you think about trees and water and all that. But in biblical times, oftentimes the wilderness was referred to as a desert. So Hagar has left the best of Abraham, because he was a very wealthy man, very influential man. So she left being well taken care of, and now she is living in the desert, and she is all alone because of Sarah's treatment of her. So I want to unpack this and visualize and put some context to this. So even though she was compliant, Hagar was compliant to the wishes of Sarah, it quickly took a turn for the worse. The two women, you go back and look at Bible commentaries on this, and Bible commentaries, they're all very clear and they're all very consistent that these two women got to the point where they despised each other. They didn't like each other. They didn't like hanging around each other. They didn't have anything good to say about each other whatsoever. And Sarah became jealous of Hagar and Abraham's relationship. She was also embarrassed because if you go back and look at the history of this, it was in biblical times considered a curse if a woman could not bear children. So Hagar was able to give Abraham children, but Sarah, his wife, could not do. So think about it. Every day, Sarah had to watch Hagar as she was preparing the nursery. Everyone was attending the baby showers. So this is all over social media. You can imagine how this made Sarah feel. And in response, she mistreated in an unjust way Hagar, to the point that she ran away. Now, again, I want you to think about this. So Abraham was a very rich, he was a very influential man. Meaning, as long as Hagar was there in his household, she had everything that she needed and everything that her children would need. And now she has ran away from all of that, and she's living in the desert. So she had no friends. There was no community there. She's alone. There's nothing and no one there with her. She was alone in her pain of what was. What was that she was being mistreated. She has no friends, no family. There's no outcome. But there's also the pain of what may never be again. She had no idea if she was ever going to get to go back and live in Abraham's house, if she was going to have food again, if she was even going to survive the valley of the desert. She had no idea. So there's some grief of what may never be again. It feels, for some of you, maybe you can relate to Hagar. It feels like today you are in a desert and you are experiencing the pain of yesterday. Maybe you have lost your desire and your drive for your marriage, your career, your family, or even life itself. Maybe you have been mistreated, even oppressed, and have run away, trying to hide from your pain. You may feel alone, and you may think and feel today, I'm never going to be happy, and I'm never going to be content again. Some of you may be thinking, I have run away, I'm in this desert, and as far as I know, I'm going to die here. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in this desert. What I want you to know from this point, there's a silent pain of loneliness. It can be the silent whisper of the devil telling you it's your fault. You are an outcast, no one likes you, and no one loves you. Others may not see your pain, but it's there and it's very real. It's a holiday weekend. And for most, it's a time of cooking burgers. It's a time of hanging out with our friends and our family and watching fireworks, shooting fireworks. It's one of those moments, it's one of those weekends. But for some of you, it's a reminder that you are alone. And so when you get on social media, you see everybody hanging out with their friends, hanging out with their family, and it's just like everybody's happy but you. It's just a reminder that you're alone, that you're in your desert. Everybody's having a great time except me. Now, thank you, Pastor Joe, for totally demoralizing me today. I'm so glad I came to Northwest Church. It is so encouraging. Where do I go from here? That's what we really want to know today, because I want you to look at me. It doesn't matter if today is your first day in church or you come every single Sunday. It doesn't matter if you've been saved one day or every day of your life. You are going to experience some moments of loneliness, and there's pain in that loneliness. And I want you to know that is a trick of the enemy to get you alone and to make you feel like that you're all by yourself. But I got good news for you today, that God's not going to leave you in your pain, and God's not going to leave you where you are. Point number 2. This is very important. God sees me in my pain. God sees me. So we're not denying pain, are we? No, our head's not stuck in the sand. We don't have church smile. No, we don't have the facade. Everything's okay. Everything's great. No, we're not denying this. We're not displaying. No, we get it. There's a lot of pain in loneliness. I get it. But what I want you to take away with to this morning, put it in your backpack, is that God sees me in my pain. Look at verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord. I want you to underline that phrase, angel of the Lord. Circle that, highlight that. Found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness. Here's what I want you to write down. This morning, if you're taking notes. The word angel, write that word down. Here's what it means. It means a messenger of God. Angel literally means a messenger of God. And if you go back and you look in the Old Testament, oftentimes you will read stories where God would send an angel with a message from him. So an angel was a messenger. Again, here's what God said. Show up and say, okay, Robert, here's what God said. It's an angel of the Lord. But if you go back and you look at Bible commentary on this, I thought this was very interesting. Here in this particular passage, it is referring to the second person of the Godhead, meaning the angel was the second, watch this, was the second person of the Godhead, meaning this was Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So this was not an ordinary angel showing up in the middle of the desert to deliver a handwritten note from God the Father, but this was God the Son representing God the Father. And it was really a foreshadowing in the Old Testament of Jesus Christ coming in the New Testament. This was Jesus Christ showing up in the middle of the desert to this lowly servant girl saying, I just want you to know that my Father cares enough about you that he just didn't send a normal angel, a regular angel, but he sent the second in command. He sent the Son of God just to tell you that he sees you in the middle of your pain. Now that's encouraging to know that wherever we are in our life, that God sees us. He sent his supreme messenger to this lonely and lowly servant girl to simply say, I see you in the middle of your pain. Look at verse 13. After all of this, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. Now watch this. It's one thing for God to see you, but it's a whole new level when you know that God sees you. Oh, you aren't getting this. I said it's one thing when you know that God sees you, but it's another when you know that God sees you. When you know that and you can experience that. The Hebrew name for God here is Yahweh. It means that God sees me in my distress and my difficulty. God sees it all. Why? Because he is omnipresent. Hagar was running away from her problem. And she ran to the desert where there was no thing and no one there to get away from her problem. But here's what I want to say to you. How do you run away from a God who is everywhere all at the same time? So how do you play hide and seek with a God who is everywhere at the same time? So if she's in Abraham's house, guess what? God is there. If she runs away to the desert, guess what? God is already there. So wherever you run to this morning, you write it down. When you get there, God's going to be there when you get there. Go and read the story of Jonah in the Old Testament. Wherever he went to the other side of the earth, and when he got there, God's like, hey, where you been? Been waiting on you. So he's like running over here. Hey, God. And then you run away over here. It's like, well, hello, God. Because he's everywhere at the same time. So God just wanted her to know, I see you in your pain. I know this. God is often silent, but he is never absent. Don't confuse those two. Because sometimes in our pain, we want a word from God. That's what people talk about all the time. I need a word from God. I need to know that God hears me. I want God to speak to me. I don't care how spiritual you are. God does not promise anywhere in his scripture that he's always going to speak. But he does promise that he's not going to leave you. That he's not going to forsake you, that you're never going to be alone. So he is silent often, but he is never absent. When it feels as if no one cares for you or sees you, God does. We show everyone our highlight reels on social media, but God has the ability to see the behind the scenes moment. So, do you think Hagar is on social media going, hey, I'm in the desert. Look at me, there's no one here, it's just me. Everybody's mistreated me. This is wrong, this is unjust, this is unfair. Look at me, pouty me. No, we don't do that on social media. We don't show the world our behind the scenes, but we do serve a God this morning that not only sees behind the scenes, but he's there with us. When we pull the curtain and we want to hide from everything and everyone, God is already there when you pull that curtain. When life and people are unfair and unjust, he sees you. When people hurt you with their words and their ways, he sees you. He sees you in your silent pain because he is there. Now, the same messenger in Genesis who saw Hagar is the same messenger who said in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, he says, I will never fail you. That's literally translated in the Greek language as, I will never give up on you. Oh, let's just stop. Isn't that good? That God said, I will never give up on you in the midst of your pain. This morning, your pain may be a result of your own decision. Or it may be the result of somebody else, like Sarah mistreating Hagar. It may be somebody else's fault, okay? But what does God say? He says, I will never what? Give up on you. I will never fail you. He goes on to say in that verse, I will never abandon you. That is literally translated in the Greek languages, I will never leave you behind. I will never give up on you, and I will never leave you behind. Even though you're in the desert, even though you're in the midst of your pain, even though it feels like there's no one around you, no one cares about you, no one really sees you, he says, I am not going to give up on you, and I'm not going to leave you behind. Meaning, I'm not going to leave you the way I found you. He found Hagar in the desert, but he didn't leave her in the desert. Which brings me to point number 3. There is the restoration after my pain. Genesis chapter 16, verse 9 says, the angel of the Lord said to her, now watch this, return. Everybody say return. Oh yeah, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. I'd be like, but Lord, is there not another way? But Lord, do you not remember how she treated me? She ran me off. Now watch what happens in verse 9. It says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. Before Hagar could be restored, she had to return to the person who caused her to run away. That's powerful, isn't it? She had to return and submit to the very person who had oppressed her. Now, again, you hear me say this often. So I'm a visual person. So I'm visualizing this. I'm putting this sermon together. I'm visualizing this. And Jesus Christ has just spoken to Hagar and said, I want you to return to Sarah, and I want you to submit to her authority. Well, she does it. We know that. But can you imagine that walk, what that must have felt like, that journey? You think the conversation could have went something like, Lord, I know what you're doing, and I don't, and surely, Lord, you're God. Is there not another way? Do you not know how she treated me? And this whole time, she's probably saying things like, what's Sarah's response going to be for me? Is she going to kill me? What's Abraham going to do? My master, was he going to run me off again? And what about all my friends at church and all the people in my community, in my Connect group? Are they going to welcome me back? What's this going to be like? The whole time, she's having to return to her pain point. She had to return back to the train wreck before she could get her restoration. And the reason a lot of us never experience restoration in our life is because we're not willing to obey what the voice of the Holy Spirit is speaking to us. And oftentimes, He wants us to return back to that pain point. Not to stay there, not to live there, not necessarily to relive that, but there's just something about returning back that God says, you got to return before I can heal you. You got to go back to that place in which you were hurt. You got to go back to that place where you were mistreated. You got to go back to that place where oppression was, and you got to go back. But when you get there, I want you to know it's going to be different when you leave this time, because this time you're not going to be running away, but you're going to be running with my blessings. You're not going to be running away from Sarah, but you're going to be running with my blessings. There's just something about return that God says when you return and you become obedient, when you humble yourself, that's what this is all about. It's when you humble yourself and you trust me. This is not about Abraham. This is not about Sarah. This is simply about you, Hagar, trusting me that I know what's best for your life. Because if it was left up to Hagar, if I was there, I'd be like, I'm not going back. I'm going to go back. I'm going to slap her if I go back. I'm not going back there. No, it's not what this is all about. I'm sure it was a lonely, hard walk. But she did return. God did hear her cry of distress, and He restored and rewarded her with a son. Again, sometimes we have to return before we can be restored. You may have to go back to the same breaking point where God can restore your brokenness. The road of restoration is not always, what's this? An easy one. The road of restoration is not an easy one. Because let me tell you something. Even when you hear from God, and you know God spoke to you and said, this is the road to restoration, I'm telling you, the devil will be hiding out at every point he can to distract you and to discourage you, because he doesn't want you restored and living the life that God wants you to live. So he's going to be hiding out on that path of restoration. And you think once you hear from God and you start down that road, it's going to be a rosy path. No, the war has just begun, because the enemy says, what does Jesus say about the enemy? He comes to what? Kill, steal, and to destroy. That's what this is all about. He wants to take away your restoration. He wants to rob you of that restoration. He wants to make sure that it never happens in your life, because again, he wants you living in bondage. He wants you to feel alone. He wants you to feel the pain, and he never wants you to leave that. But Jesus said, I have come what? That you might have freedom. He wants to set you free from the pain that you've been in. Path of restoration. We think God's just going to swoop down and make all things right. We just like, okay, God's going to come down and go, okay, this is it, boom, and then everything's going to be great. No, we forget that we play a big part in this. And I talked about this last week, that we have to do our best, and then when we do our best, we leave the rest up to the Lord. Could it be the reason he hasn't done the rest is because we haven't first done our best? Hagar had to return back to Sarah, and not only return, but submit to her authority. Go back and say, I was wrong. Even though you mistreated me, I'm wrong. I'm submitting to your authority. And God took care of the rest of it. The path of restoration can be a process of humility and trust. Trust as we walk in obedience, knowing he will restore what has been taken. God said in Joel chapter 2, verse 25, the Lord says, I will give you back what you have lost. Isn't that awesome? I will give you back what you have lost. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10 says, after you have suffered a little while, he will restore. That word restore in the Greek language means to mend what has been broken, support, strengthen you, and he will place you on a firm foundation. The message says, will have you put together and on your feet for good. He gets the last word. Yes, he does. I'm here to tell you, you may be in the desert, but God has the last word. You may be broken this morning, but God has the last word. Your marriage may be on the last leg, but God has the last word. Your kids may not be living for the Lord today, but God, guess what? God has the last word. Maybe your job, maybe your career laid you off, but God has the last word. Maybe the doctor came in and said, well, this is what I say. This is what. No, God has the last word. He always does. So no matter what you're facing today, God has stamped your life temporarily out of order, because the day is coming when the great repairman will restore your life so it works the way that he intended for it all alone. It's God. Maybe not this day, but someday. He promises in Revelation 21 verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. The Bible commentaries on this, they all say this, that at that point, life will be perfected. When he wipes away every tear, life will be perfected. Now watch this. That's not today, that is someday in the future. So we have someday as a point of reference, and we have today. Watch this. Are you looking at me? We have today as a point of reference, and we have a someday point of reference. Watch this. Between this day and someday, there's going to be a lot of tears, and there's going to be a lot of heartache, and there's going to be a lot of pain. But someday, he's going to restore. And it's the someday that gets me through this day. Because someday, I know someday's coming. And that's what gets me through this day. Because if someday's coming, that tells me this day's not going to be forever. I live for someday. That's what gets me through this day. Life will be perfected someday. God this morning sees your pain. He has sent a messenger by this morning to tell you that he sees your pain, that he's in the process of restoring what has been lost. Now I want you to look at me. You got to get this. I feel this in my spirit today. You got to fight for that restoration. It's not a given. It's hard work. It's intentional, and you got to fight. And you got to lay it on the line with the devil and say, let's get it on, because this is worth fighting for. My restoration is worth fighting for. Will you bow your head this morning, please?
Thank you so much today for tuning in and checking out the message. We hope you were encouraged. And today, if you'd like to make a decision to become a Christ follower, please contact us. You can do that by simply clicking the link in the description below. And today, if you'd like more information about Northwest Church, or you would like to plan a visit to come visit us in person, you can simply do that by going to northwestchurch.tv. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to connect with you.